They weren't supposed to be there. Not officially, not in the briefings shown to the press, and certainly not in the reports sent back to London. While American armored convoys dominated the roads and helicopters circled overhead, another war was unfolding in the shadows of Baghdad. Quieter, more precise, and far more dangerous. It was fought by a handful of men in ordinary cars, dressed like locals, moving through neighborhoods where even the hint of a foreign accent could get you killed in seconds. This was the war of the British SAS, and by 2006 it had reached a level of intensity that almost no one outside a closed circle would ever fully understand. By early 2006, Baghdad had stopped functioning as a normal city. It had become a fragmented battle space, divided between insurgents, militias, criminal networks, and foreign fighters, with control shifting block by block, sometimes hour by hour. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had evolved into something far more dangerous than expected. A decentralized system capable of coordinating attacks across the city with relentless efficiency. Car bombs, kidnappings, targeted killings, these were no longer spikes of violence, they were the baseline. American forces responded with overwhelming power, armored patrols, constant air support, aggressive raids. But the enemy adapted just as quickly. Every convoy was seen before it arrived, every helicopter warned the target to disappear. The war was no longer about territory. It was about information, and increasingly, the initiative was slipping away. That was the gap the SAS were sent to fill. Operating under the classified umbrella of Task Force Black, they were tasked not with dominating the battlefield, but dismantling it from within. No uniforms, no visible presence, no signature that could be tracked. Where conventional forces moved with force, the SAS moved invisibly, deep inside the city, through markets, alleyways, and residential blocks, where one mistake could turn a mission into a fatal ambush within seconds. Their advantage wasn't firepower, but the ability to blend in and maintain control in an environment defined by chaos. Every operation began long before anyone stepped outside. Inside secure compounds, intelligence teams worked continuously, piecing together fragments, intercepted calls, informant tips, patterns hidden in repetition. The SAS didn't chase high-profile targets. They focused on networks, facilitators, couriers, financiers, the people who held everything together. Remove them, and entire chains of operations could collapse. But doing that required getting close, far closer than conventional forces could afford. The team assigned to this mission consisted of 8 men. No heavy armor, no visible insignia, minimal gear. Some wore traditional Iraqi clothing, others dressed as contractors or locals moving between districts. Their vehicles were just as important. Worn civilian cars with no protection, chosen specifically because they didn't stand out. Everything about the operation depended on one principle: remain invisible. Inside one of the cars, a sergeant checked his watch. The target had been under surveillance for 72 hours. A mid-level facilitator tied to a network responsible for multiple vehicle-borne bombings. Not a headline figure, but a critical node. Removing him wouldn't end the war, but it could disrupt it in ways that mattered. The risk was obvious. The neighborhood wasn't neutral. It was effectively controlled by insurgents. Outsiders were noticed, patterns were tracked, and anything unusual triggered attention. If the team was identified, there would be almost no time to recover. They moved just after dusk, using the inconsistency of the city to their advantage. 2 vehicles, no formation, blending into traffic, no sudden movements, no unnecessary communication. Inside the lead car, the team leader watched everything, not just the road, but the behavior of the environment. Who was looking? Who wasn't? Where people stood too long? Because in Baghdad, absence could be as dangerous as presence. The first sign of trouble came 3 blocks from the target. A group of men stood on a corner, doing nothing in particular, but watching too closely for too long. The driver didn't react. He couldn't. Any change in behavior could confirm suspicion. So they continued, steady and controlled, as if nothing was wrong. The safe house looked exactly as expected, narrow, indistinct, identical to the surrounding buildings. The plan was simple. 2 operators approach, the rest provide cover, fast entry, secure the target, and leave before the environment reacts. On paper, it was clean. In Baghdad, that didn't mean much. As the 2 operators stepped out, the world seemed to sharpen. Every sound carried weight, a door opening somewhere nearby, a distant engine, footsteps on concrete. They reached the entrance and knocked. Once, then again. The door opened, and everything accelerated. The entry was immediate. Inside, the space was tighter than expected. The target was there, but not alone. Commands were issued in Arabic. A sudden movement forced a split-second decision, and suppressed gunfire ended it. By the time the rest of the team entered, it was already over. 2 down, 1 detained. No alarms, no immediate reaction from outside. For a brief moment, it looked like the operation had gone exactly as planned. Then the situation shifted, not inside but outside. One of the drivers noticed a vehicle approaching slowly down the street. Not unusual, but deliberate. 3 men inside, watching. Seconds later, another vehicle appeared from the opposite direction. Then another. No clear coordination, but no coincidence either. Inside the house, the message came through. Possible compromise. That was enough. The timeline collapsed instantly. What had been a controlled extraction became a race against a closing window. The detainee was secured and moved immediately. No time for secondary searches, no time to exploit the location further. The priority had changed from intelligence to survival. As they stepped back into the street, the difference was immediate. More movement, more people, more attention. The environment was reacting. The first shot came from a distance, not precise, more of a test. Then another closer. Within seconds, the situation began to unravel. Contact front. Contact rear. The encirclement was forming. Engines were already running as the team pushed the detainee into the vehicles and accelerated out. The street transformed instantly. Men emerging from buildings, weapons appearing from nowhere, vehicles repositioning with clear intent. This wasn't spontaneous. It was organized. The lead car swerved hard to avoid a block, gunfire intensifying behind them as rounds struck metal and shattered glass. They didn't stop. Stopping meant being fixed, and being fixed meant being surrounded. Inside the vehicle, everything remained controlled. No panic, no wasted movement, just precise actions under pressure. They pushed through one block, then another, but the threat was no longer behind them. It was building ahead. The radio crackled. Multiple vehicles moving to intercept. The team leader looked at the driver. No words were needed. This was no longer a compromised operation. It was a pursuit. And in Baghdad, That meant the worst part of the fight was just beginning. The first turn didn't buy them much time. The lead vehicle cut hard into a side street, tires briefly losing grip on loose dust and debris before catching traction again. Behind them, the sound of engines followed almost immediately. This wasn't a random reaction from the street. It was coordinated, fast, and aggressive. Whoever they had hit inside that house mattered more than expected, or the network around him was far more responsive than intelligence had suggested. Either way, the situation had escalated beyond a simple compromised extraction. This was now a mobile engagement, and the SAS were outnumbered, outpositioned, and operating without visible support. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere remained controlled, but the shift was undeniable. The driver pushed the car harder, threading through narrow streets with minimal clearance, while the front passenger tracked movement through the windshield and side mirrors, calling out positions in short, precise updates. No one wasted words. No one asked questions. The detainee, restrained and disoriented, was forced down between the seats, kept low to avoid drawing attention from outside. The second vehicle stayed close but not too close, maintaining just enough distance to avoid being taken out together if the road ahead was blocked. Another turn, then another. The route wasn't pre-planned anymore. It was adaptive, built in real time, based on what the drivers could see and what the team could anticipate. Baghdad's streets weren't designed for this kind of movement. They were tight, irregular, unpredictable, full of blind corners and sudden obstacles. Perfect terrain for an ambush. The radio crackled again, brief, fragmented. 2 vehicles still behind, one attempting to flank. That was enough. They weren't just being followed. They were being maneuvered against. A pickup truck appeared ahead, slowing just enough to force a decision. The lead driver didn't hesitate. He accelerated, closing the distance aggressively, forcing the other driver to react first. At the last second, the pickup swerved aside, either unwilling or unprepared to commit to a collision. The SAS vehicle pushed through the gap without slowing. Behind them, gunfire resumed. More controlled now, more deliberate. Rounds struck the rear of the vehicle, punching through metal and glass. Still, no immediate return fire. Not yet. Every shot fired would escalate the situation further, and escalation in this environment meant losing what little control they still had. They broke onto a slightly wider road, and for a moment, it looked like they might create distance. Civilian traffic reappeared, scattered, inconsistent, but enough to complicate pursuit. The driver used it, weaving through gaps, forcing the trailing vehicles to either slow down or take risks. One of them chose the latter. A sedan accelerated hard, cutting across lanes, ignoring everything around it. It wasn't trying to keep up anymore. It was trying to end it. Contact rear, closing fast. This time, the response came immediately. A controlled burst from the rear passenger shattered the pursuing vehicle's windshield. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to disrupt the driver. The sedan veered, clipped another car, and spun out behind them. No follow-up shots, no confirmation. Just enough force applied to break momentum. It worked, temporarily. But the radio cut through again. More vehicles ahead. Possible block. That changed everything. The driver slowed just slightly. Not hesitation, but calculation. Speed alone wouldn't get them out anymore. They needed space. unpredictability, something the opposing side couldn't easily anticipate. The team leader leaned forward, scanning the road ahead. Civilian presence was thinning again. That was a bad sign. In Baghdad, empty streets didn't mean safety. They meant preparation. The turn came suddenly. A narrow alley, barely wide enough for the vehicle. The driver took it without warning, forcing the second car to react instantly and follow. The space tightened around them, walls closing in, visibility dropping to almost nothing. If this was blocked at the far end, they were done. No room to maneuver, no room to fight effectively. Halfway through, debris appeared, scattered, not enough to stop them, but enough to slow them. Intentional or incidental, it didn't matter. The effect was the same. The vehicle pushed through, suspension taking the impact, speed dropping just enough to feel exposed. No shots yet. That was worse. It meant whoever was ahead was waiting for a better moment. They burst out of the alley into another street and immediately saw the problem. A vehicle angled across the road, not fully blocking it, just enough. A choke point. The kind designed to force hesitation. The driver didn't hesitate. He accelerated straight at it. At the last possible second, he shifted slightly, clipping the edge of the blocking vehicle hard enough to push it aside without stopping completely. Metal scraped, glass shattered, but momentum held. The car broke through. Behind them, the second vehicle followed, taking even more impact but forcing its way past. Now the shooting started in earnest. From the side. From behind. Less controlled. More volume. The restraint on the other side was gone. The street echoed with gunfire as the SAS vehicles pushed forward, fully exposed. Inside, the team adjusted instantly. Weapons came up, angles covered, fire returned, short, precise, nothing wasted, not suppression, not panic, just targeted responses to immediate threats. They weren't trying to win the fight. They were trying to survive it. Another turn, another block. The pattern repeated. Movement, contact, break contact, move again. But the pressure wasn't dropping. If anything, it was increasing. More vehicles were joining. Word was spreading faster than they could outrun it. This wasn't just a local reaction anymore. The network was activating. Then came the worst moment. The lead vehicle turned into a wider road and immediately had to brake. Traffic. Not moving. Too dense to push through at speed. For the first time since the contact began, they were forced to slow down significantly. The second vehicle closed the gap behind them. There was no spacing anymore, no buffer. Multiple contacts closing. The team leader made the call instantly. Push through. There was no alternative. The driver leaned on the horn, forcing movement, nudging through gaps, using the sheer aggression of the situation to break the natural flow of traffic. Civilians reacted unpredictably. Some moved, some froze, some tried to escape the chaos. The SAS vehicles forced their way forward inch by inch, exposed, visible, vulnerable. Behind them, engines grew louder. They were catching up again. A shot cracked past the side of the vehicle, close enough to feel. Another hit the rear window, shattering what remained of it. The team responded immediately, controlled fire out the back, just enough to keep distance, just enough to disrupt. Still not escalating beyond necessity. Then finally, a break. A gap opened ahead. Small, but enough. The driver took it instantly, forcing the vehicle through and accelerating hard as the road cleared just enough to regain speed. The second vehicle followed, almost losing control before stabilizing and pushing forward again. Distance. Not much, but something. The radio came alive again, but this time the tone had shifted. QRF moving. 2 minutes. That was the first real advantage they'd had since the contact began. But 2 minutes in this environment was a long time. Too long. They pushed harder. Every turn now was calculated toward one objective, reaching a point where support could actually reach them. The pursuit didn't stop, but it fractured. Some vehicles dropped off. Others hesitated. The coordination wasn't as tight anymore. The window was opening. Then, in the distance, a sound cut through everything else. Rotors. Faint at first. Then clearer. Low. Fast-moving. Not subtle. Not hidden. American air support. The effect was immediate. Vehicles behind them began to break off. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to feel the shift. Enough to know the balance had changed. The SAS didn't slow down. Not yet. They kept moving until the environment no longer felt like a trap, until the streets started to behave like streets again, instead of a battlefield. Only then did the pace begin to drop. Just slightly. Just enough to regain full control. Inside the vehicle, no one spoke. The adrenaline hadn't worn off yet. The detainee was still there. Alive. The mission, somehow, had held. But the margin had been almost nothing. What happened that night didn't appear in any official report in full detail. It wasn't something that could be easily explained in a briefing or reduced to a clean summary. Because it exposed something uncomfortable, that in Baghdad, even the most precise operations could collapse in seconds. And survival often depended not on planning, but on the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. For Task Force Black, it was just one operation among many, but it reinforced a reality they already understood. They weren't controlling the battlefield. They were surviving inside it. By the time the vehicles finally slowed, the fight was already behind them, at least physically. The streets had changed again, almost as if nothing had happened. Civilian traffic resumed its irregular flow, people moved along sidewalks, and the city continued in that strange, fractured rhythm that defined Baghdad in 2006. But inside the vehicles, the reality of what had just taken place hadn't caught up yet. No one spoke. There was no immediate debrief, no release of tension, just controlled breathing, steady scanning, and the quiet understanding that they had come extremely close to not making it out. The first secure location wasn't far, but it felt distant. Distance in Baghdad wasn't measured in kilometers. It was measured in how many things could go wrong between point A and point B when they finally passed through the outer layer of security and into a controlled compound. The shift was immediate and almost disorienting. Weapons lowered slightly. Doors opened. Fresh air moved through the vehicle interiors, carrying with it the first real sense of separation from the environment they had just fought through. The detainee was pulled out first, still restrained, still disoriented, still alive. That alone justified everything that had just happened. Because despite the chaos, despite the compromise, despite the fact that the operation had turned into a running fight through hostile territory, the objective had technically been achieved. But in Task Force Black, technically, was never enough. The debrief began almost immediately. Not formal at first, just fragments. Short exchanges between operators, confirming what each had seen, what each had done, where things had started to shift. Memory in these situations degraded quickly under stress, and capturing it early mattered. Times were approximated, positions reconstructed, key moments identified. Where was the first indicator? The men on the corner. Too aware, too still. Not definitive on their own, but in hindsight, the first break in the pattern. Then the vehicles, the slow approach, the observation, the timing. That wasn't spontaneous. That was recognition. Which led to the central question. When were they compromised? Before the approach? During surveillance? Or the moment they entered the neighborhood? There was no immediate answer, but the implications were serious. Task Force Black operated on the assumption that invisibility was their greatest advantage. If that invisibility was breaking down, even occasionally, then every operation carried a higher level of risk than anticipated. Inside the intelligence section, the focus shifted quickly. Communications logs were pulled, surveillance timelines reviewed, informant reliability reassessed. Patterns that had previously seemed insignificant were now re-examined under a different lens. Because insurgent networks in Baghdad didn't just react. They observed. They adapted. And sometimes they anticipated. What became clear over the following hours was that the network surrounding the target had not been passive. The facilitator they had captured wasn't just a logistical node. He was connected to a localized support structure that included lookouts, drivers, and rapid response elements. Not formal units, not trained in the conventional sense, but organized enough to respond quickly when something disrupted their environment. That explained the speed of the reaction. It explained the vehicles. It explained the attempted containment. What it didn't explain, at least not fully, was how quickly they had been identified. And that uncertainty mattered more than anything else. The detainee, once processed, began to fill in some of the gaps. Not immediately, not cleanly. Information came in fragments, often incomplete, sometimes misleading, but over time, a clearer picture began to form. The house had not been a primary operational hub. It was a transit point, temporary, flexible, used to move people and materials without creating a fixed signature. That was why it had been difficult to detect. That was also why it had been active. The presence of multiple individuals inside at the time of entry hadn't been coincidence. It had been timing. Bad timing. More importantly, the network had built layers of informal security around itself. Local awareness, unspoken signals, movement that didn't look coordinated, but was. The men on the corner? Not armed fighters, observers, the vehicles, not a pre-planned ambush, a rapid aggregation of available assets. In other words, the SAS hadn't driven into a trap. They had triggered one. That distinction mattered, because it meant the environment itself was becoming reactive, capable of detecting anomalies and responding faster than before. It meant that even a perfectly executed operation could collapse if the surrounding network was alert enough. And in Baghdad, in 2006, that level of alertness was becoming more common. Despite that, the operation had still achieved its primary objective. The detainee wasn't just another name. He was a connector. Within 48 hours, the intelligence extracted from him began to produce results. names, locations, secondary contacts, safe houses that had not previously been identified, financial links that extended beyond the immediate district. One operation led to another, then another. Not large-scale raids, but targeted actions, each one removing another piece of the network. This was how Task Force Black operated at its most effective. Not through single decisive strikes, but through sustained pressure, systematic dismantling. Weeks later, the effects were measurable. VBIED activity linked to that network dropped significantly, not eliminated, but disrupted. And in Baghdad, disruption saved lives. For the operators involved, however, the outcome was more personal. The mission had worked, but it had come dangerously close to failing. That balance between success and collapse was something every SAS operator in Baghdad understood intimately. There were no clean operations, no guaranteed outcomes, just a constant negotiation between risk and control, played out in an environment where the margin for error was almost non-existent. What made operations like this unique wasn't just the level of danger, it was the level of exposure. Unlike conventional forces, the SAS didn't operate behind layers of armor or overwhelming support. They moved through the same streets as everyone else, under the same conditions, with none of the visible protection. Their safety depended not on strength, but on remaining undetected for as long as possible. And when that failed, everything changed instantly. The engagement that followed the extraction wasn't exceptional. That was the uncomfortable reality. It was typical, not in its exact sequence, not in its specific details, but in its nature. Fast-moving, unpredictable, shaped as much by the environment as by the enemy. A constant shift between control and chaos, where planning could only take you so far. The rest depended on adaptability, on discipline, on experience. And that was the difference. Not equipment, not numbers, but the ability to function when the plan no longer existed. In official terms, the operation would be recorded simply. Target captured. Enemy resistance encountered. Friendly forces extracted successfully. Clean. Efficient. Incomplete. Because it left out everything that mattered. It left out the moment the street changed. The realization that they had been seen. The split-second decisions that determined whether they would break contact or be surrounded. The controlled restraint when not firing was just as important as firing. The understanding that escalation could be as dangerous as inaction. It left out the reality of what it meant to operate inside Baghdad at that time. For Task Force Black, this wasn't a single story. It was one of many. Each operation slightly different, but built on the same principles. Move quietly, strike precisely, leave before the environment reacts. And when it does react, adapt faster than it can close around you. By late 2006, that approach was having an effect. Insurgent networks were under pressure. Key facilitators were being removed faster than they could be replaced. Operational tempo was being disrupted. But the cost of that pressure was constant exposure, constant risk, constant proximity to failure. Because in the end, the SAS didn't control Baghdad. No one did. They operated inside it, navigating a battlefield that had no clear front lines, no stable rules, and no predictable outcomes. A place where the difference between success and disaster could be measured in seconds, in small decisions, in details that most people would never even notice. The operation that night didn't change the war. It didn't appear in headlines. It didn't redefine strategy. But it revealed something far more important. That in the most dangerous environments, victory isn't always about dominance. Sometimes it's about precision. Sometimes it's about timing. And sometimes it's simply about making it out alive.